Thank you.
Right.
Are you suggesting that someone's trying to make a real-life sequel?
Stab 2? Who'd want to do that? Sequels suck.
Two in the box!
Ready to go.
We be fast and
They be slow.
Wow. A second Super Saiyan? Second in order, perhaps, but by no means in stature. Your fight is with me now.
I'll have my revenge. And Deathstalker too.
Man, I can't fucking believe this. Another basement, another elevator. How can the same shit happen to the same guy twice?
Oh, please, please. By definition alone, they're inferior films.
It is one of the strangest tales ever told. I think it will thrill you. It may shock you. It might even horrify you. So if any of you feel that you do not care to subject your nerves to such a strain, now's your chance to, well, we warned you.
Centuries ago, a toy maker set out to build the perfect puzzle box. A gift that would bring enchantment to all who possessed it. He never dreamed that this simple toy was the key to the gates of hell.
Oh my God.
Do I look like someone who cares what God thinks?
Now, centuries later, a scientist has unlocked its secret. And the battle for the future of mankind is about to be fought across the boundaries of time. Welcome to Oblivion. Hellraiser. Bloodline.
Hey everyone, thank you for tuning in to Inside the Sequel. This is the podcast where we talk about sequel movies that do not get enough love or attention that they deserve. And we come on here to talk about them and recommend them to you. It's a Halloween season, so happy Spooktober to all those listening. If you're back again after our first episode on The Exorcist 2, welcome back. Hope you enjoyed that episode because we got a great one for you today. I'm your host, as always, Chris. And today we are talking about my birth year as well, with the release of the 1996 sequel, Hellraiser 4 Bloodline. And with me today, I have returning guest, highly anticipated. It's a guy I was very interested in when I was in my teens, just listening to him talk about zombie movies. And then he's back. After talking about Friday the 13th Part 5 a year ago, he's back again on a full moon to talk about Hellraiser 4. We have published author Mark Wheaton. Mark, how are you doing today?
Good. How are you? Thank you for having me back on the pod.
Oh, yeah, no problem. After you were talking about Toby Hooper and Sam Raimi a year ago, I was like, I got to get this guy back on again. And now we're going to be talking about, Flesh.
Clive Barker.
Clive Barker, Flesh.
Like flashing, little autograph headshots of Clive Barker on screen. I was getting my copy of Hellbound Heart, and I was like, oh. Like Clive put a headshot in this, and I was like, oh, okay, I forgot. Okay, this is great.
Oh, headshots. That's so interesting. Was that a thing in the Clive Barker days when he was making his films?
No author ever signed headshots to anyone ever. But I don't know. I guess Clive.
It's like when they stamped the label on him, like the best author since Stephen King. He really took that as like his career.
No, it's funny because he got that. It was the quote that ended up on every book. It was, I've seen the future of horror, and his name is Clive Barker. Stephen King. Stephen King has blurbed 1 billion books, but he did the same with Evil Dead. He really was a proponent of that. But I have seen that blurb used on so many editions of Clive Barker's work over the years that it almost feels like he could never escape that he could that Stephen King anointed him in that way, so he could never surpass him in some way. And Barker is such a different writer, and I still think the Books of Blood, at least the first 4 short story collections, are some of the greatest horror ever written. and I think it's better than a lot of Stephen King work. And I think Barker, in his influence and what he was doing, was so far ahead of his time. And I think that the more every generation that discovers his short fiction in particular is just like, wow, no one was doing this. And it's crazy. And it was very far thinking. So I'm glad that he is still being read and still being read. And Candyman movie came out, now the new Hellraiser. So people, every time there's a movie, hopefully they'll also discover his books again.
That would be cool, because like there is, it's interesting because moving back to Chicago, there's a podcast called the Losers Club podcast, and they're based it all on like Stephen King's movies and books and adaptations, and they did a 3-day movie marathon at the Music Box called Creep Show, and they played a bunch of Stephen King's like movie adaptations, and it made me think like, wow, there are so many Stephen King movie adaptations, and then it's like, what other kind of author do you see that in like that kind of genre? And it's like, I think Clive Barker, but outside of Hellraiser and maybe Candyman, I can't think. I haven't seen Nightbreeders. But the thing about Stephen King, I always say this, one of my favorite horror subgenre is Stephen King movies, because it has like that fall, like autumn feel a lot of times. But with Clive Barker, what I've seen his movies or things he's produced, I mean, he even had a video game, I think, produced
Undying,
at one point.
yeah.
And
which was a very interesting game.
It looked crazy as hell, but it just seems like his thing was like very different. We talked before recording like Todd McFarlane and like his like artwork and writing. It felt very different at the time too. It's not like Frank Miller, it's not like anything like that in like the 90s. But it's weird because like you said, they were ahead of their time. It does kind of feel like that because they're like now getting appreciated more now. And I wonder why that
roiling flesh, and just as we're going through a pandemic and everybody's body erupts against them, it's there's something Barker, there have been other authors that do this, but Barker really, the body horror element of just in the visceral nature of his stuff, his stuff can be very disgusting. It never goes like, it's never exploitive in that way, but his stuff is, one of his best stories is about two villages in Eastern Europe that fight each other by becoming giants. And the people like of one village with leather straps build themselves up into a giant made of 1,000 people. And then it fights another giant of 1,000 people. And the people who are on the feet are stomped and crushed and collapsed. And then one of the giants goes mad. There's a collective madness. And one of the witnesses of it in the last beat joins the madness and just carries off with this careening giant into the night. And it's just so not anything any other writer would ever write. And it's just visceral and about collective there's a lot of Lovecraft in it, but there's also a lot of just bodies getting churned up. And it's not exploitive. It's not like he doesn't revel in the blood and the broken bones. He does, but it isn't over revel in the blood and the broken bones. But he wants you to know that this is just humans getting devoured by this old folkloric way of solving a dispute between villages. So
it's
one's doing stuff like that in the 80s.
Yeah, it's like you think about like like nightmarish like artwork, and you think of like H.R. Geiger and like the fusion of body and machine. It's almost something like that, but it's like instead of it with something inanimate, it's like flesh on flesh, making something new.
Yeah, there's no metal. It's it's Giger's work, but with that like just, I mean, that's one of the things that's amazing about the new Bruckner Hellraiser. The Cenobites before, there was leather, there was new stuff added to the body. But with this, so often the decorations, the frills, everything with the Cenobites is their own ripped flesh, open and turned into design, which is what we were talking about with Todd McFarlane. That was such a thing that Barker was doing when he designed the Tortured Souls figures. So much of it was about taking flesh and rending it in different directions. And I really liked that Bruckner, with this version of Hellraiser, decided to make every odd piece a part of the body. Nothing was really added, unlike a lot of the other Hellraiser sequels where suddenly you see a device, you see like someone killed by compact discs has CDs in his head, and it's just stupid. This had a method to it. So
It's just so like early Silent Hill. You know what I mean?
yeah. Silent Hill feels very. I remember seeing the first Silent Hill movie and being like, wow, the imagery in here is unbelievably cool. It felt a little Barker influenced. So
definitely
maybe
one of the
not
more,
at all, but it was pretty great.
It was definitely like one of the underrated early 2000s movies for me, for sure. So
Yeah.
thank God Scream Factory put that movie out.
I mean, that's another one. We were talking about Stephen King. When Stephen King directed a movie, Maximum Overdrive. When Clive directed a movie, Hellraiser. And, you know, and Nightbreed. And there's all sorts of stuff. But it is weird when you have writers jump into directing. Because that never happens. So
yeah, especially when you have a special effects artist to direct a film. Now, before we even get to Hellraiser 4, that was the big thing you sold me on, was that the director wanted to get his name off of it. And I was like, wow, no way. And it's like, honestly, I'd only watch up to Hellraiser 2. So I went back and rewatched all the first three, and then watched the fourth one for this episode. And I have to say, man, rewatching Hellraiser 1 and 2, it's just such a treat, you know? It's just, I don't think most movies compare to those.
Hellraiser 1, it also helps that because Clive had done theater for so long, like really underground, crazy theater, it really helped with his directing. It was such a contained space, and the lighting is such a part of it. And even in the book, and even in Hellbound Heart, you have, when Frank is working on Le Marchand's box, you have, like, there's the tolling of the bells. And he knew precisely how to take that from the page into the film. And so the first one is phenomenal. The second one, they should have had $100 million more. I still love the second one like crazy. The third one, there's such interesting ideas, but you start moving away. And then the fourth one, they kind of come back. It's still Peter Atkins. Atkins is still working with Barker. And if you've read Atkins's actual original screenplay for Bloodline, it's very close. There are a lot of scenes that are the same, but the stuff that's missing is very telling. And the stuff they added, not all of it's bad. Putting the bookends with the interrogation of the descendant of Le Marchand kind of helps if you're not really steeped in the mythology. But it's the last one before Barker's like, nope, I'm out. Dimension, you do whatever you want. I still remember when 5 came out, I went to a screening and the screenwriter and director both were like, yeah, Clive signed off. And I published that. I was a reporter at the time for like Fangoria and stuff. And I wrote that. Clive called me like the next day. And he's like, I did not sign. I do not like. And he was like, I don't know how much I can say on the record, but he went on the record to say, no, he did not sign off on the movie and he was finished.
So back then when he called, was it just like a wire phone, or did you have one of those cool flip phones at the time?
I'm trying to think. I probably had one of those ones from the early like cancer stuff when they started doing the little meme where it looked like the X-ray of the little Motorola against your head. I bet it looked like that. So.
I don't know, Mark. Just looking at you in the 90s, I feel like you probably were that guy who had like a phone with a tongue that was like from Nightmare on Elm Street Part 1 as a gag phone that you would use. Because like we had like hamburger phones and all those novelty stuff.
I had a Garfield phone. Those things are great.
Shout out Garfield.
Yeah,
oh my God. That's awesome. Well, I mean, Mark, I'd love to get more into it, but first, like, it's been over a year. Like, what have you been up to, man? Like, has there been anything you've been working on your side with any writing? Have you been watching any scary movies lately for this October?
Well, the new Hellraiser. Trying to think what else was good. I've seen a lot of crap, but I guess I've read a lot of good horror. Like authors like Haley Piper, who I really love, and Latina Castro. Oh, and there was a new take on Dr. Moreau that the woman who wrote Mexican Gothic, Silvia Moreno Garcia, wrote. And it was just, it reconceived Dr. Moreau in Mexico during the revolution. It was like and it was fascinating because the hybrid beasts are so secondary to what Moreau is attempting to do, to what kind of civilization he's trying to create. And it almost felt influenced by that movie, the Charles Laughton version, Island of Lost Souls, more than the H.G. Wells novel, and really doing an adaptation of where the Panther Lady character might have come into the story, which is much more featured in Island of Lost Souls, because in the original book, she's in the end and she's gone. And it was really, she's such an interesting author anyway. And that was one of the best, I guess, it wasn't really scary, but it was being sold as a horror novel, but it was really good. So I've been reading a ton of good horror. So
that's awesome. Do you have, I don't think I asked last year, but do you have any like rituals or like, certain things that you do during the October season? Like you see people post 31 days of horror challenge, or usually it's the ABC family movies mostly, or they'll go try and see certain screenings. For me, it's been trying to see more repertoire screenings at the theaters here in Chicago. So that's been kind of my thing. So we had before recording, I talked about where I went to go see some movies at the Music Box Theater here in Chicago. So I saw Creepshow, which was a whole Stephen King marathon hosted by the Losers Club. But the big one for me was I was excited for is I purchased a double feature ticket at the Music Box, and same double bill they did in 1966, and the first U.S. screening was in Chicago. I got to see Dracula, Prince of Darkness, and Plague of the Zombies from *66, and it was awesome.
That would be fun to see.
Yeah,
that's cool.
So that was that. I mean, Plague of the Zombies was my favorite Hammer horror, and then that was on a Wednesday, and that same week, Monday, I watched Mask of the Red Death for the first time in theaters, and that was on a new 4K 35 millimeter. It was like a Frankenstein put together through Joe Dante and another filmmaker, and it was an amazing time. It was a packed theater, so that's what I've been trying to do.
How do people take Vincent? Like people, I mean, I grew up on Vincent Price, so I adore Vincent Price. Mm-hmm. Modern audiences, how did they respond to Mask of the Red Death? Okay.
They loved it. I mean, Vincent Price, he just captures a screen. Every time his one-liners, people cracking up, or you could hear people in the crowd go, ooh, And then with Dracula, Prince of Darkness, I mean, the dialogue is notoriously, so bad that Christopher Lee said he wasn't going to say a word in the whole movie. But the audiences were great for it. And it was like a lot of older people. It was fair. I'm only 26, and there was people my age and a lot younger watching them and talking about before screening their favorite Hammer movies and the Universal movies. I was like, oh, that's so cool. And they also did like pre-show trailers, and they did like old cartoons and stuff before the showing. So that's been like my big thing this Halloween, besides watching Rob Zombie's The Munsters, of course.
Yeah, I got about 10 minutes into that.
Oh no, Mark!
I know. I feel I'm a bad patriot. I mean, I'll watch the rest of it. I just wanted to say, and then probably again. I do the same thing with Hammer. It's just not Hammer. I do Amicus and Hammer, but it's not Halloween for me unless I guess I watch The Devil Rides Out every October. But because my sister and I used to watch it, back to Stephen King, I watch Silver Bullet every October.
Ooh, nice.
And I know that it's not beloved, but if you see it as a child, like everybody else has Goonies or whatever.
Yeah.
I have, and people and Monster Squad. For me, my childhood movie is Silver Bullet. And I mean, every time I watch it, where you see like the werewolf arm with the bat, like beating people, and I'm just like, I get that people have a negative reaction to this film. To me, I think it's like the greatest. I love the movie. I love every beat of that film. So
Silver Bullet is slowly becoming one of my favorite Stephen King movies. Like I thought it was Misery, but I'm like, I mean, Silver Bullet's coming up there.
It's Everett McGill. Stephen King characters sometimes are hard to nail. That's what's Hearts in Atlantis is beloved by nobody. But the first half of that, like everybody really nails how to act a Stephen King character torn straight from the books. That kind of Norman Rockwell thing that King has going on. And Silver Bullet, with the sister's voiceover and with just the pain that Everett McGill has, just like, I don't want to be a werewolf. So we're going to see that as a church full of like organ playing werewolves, but the horror of having a priest having the curse, like, that's Stephen King. That's fantastic. That's very American. That's very Norman Rockwell. That's very Americana in its own way, because it's very New England Christian. So it's, I don't know. Silver Bullet works for me.
That's crazy. I never would have thought that somebody else, besides like my inner circle would be like, Silver Bullet's great. And I'm like, yeah. Oh, wait, really? That's awesome.
I know you're supposed to say like yes, Stand By Me. But I'm like, nah, man, Silver Bullet's so much better.
Again, the same reason why this podcast started. Like, imagine it, Mark, if I had you on and I said, let's just talk about the first Hellraiser for an hour and a half. It's like, yes, that would be an awesome conversation, but we'd be saying the same thing. So we're talking about Hellraiser 4 Bloodline, which that's a first watch for me. And before we even talk about that, we got to talk about the man, Clive Barker. We talked about in the recording, I'm really into like Todd McFarlane and like his style and stuff, but like obviously I knew in the 90s that was definitely a growing trend. Whether it's like, then you think about like David Cronenberg with the body horror in the 80s as well, going into the 90s. Hellraiser kind of feels like that, but it's not the same as body horror. It's more or less like just very gruesome, pushing a hard R violence and oddly sexualizing it in some sort of grotesque way. I don't know. Hellraiser's a horny movie, the first one, but I still love it because it's that and then some. You know what I mean?
Well, his book, it's funny because he very late published his plays. He published 2 volumes of the plays that Dog Company, which Doug Bradley was in. He published his plays, and if you read the plays, they are some of them are unproducible. Like, there's one about Goya where the stage explodes, and it's amazing, and it's a retelling of Frankenstein, and it's wild. And then there's one that was a cast of 30, and it was called The History of the Devil, and the devil's on trial. And I actually I directed it in Texas. And it turns out we were the first idiots to ever do it in Texas. So Texas, Clive Barker, History of the Devil. But it was just this play that was the devil on trial for all the sins he committed. But it turns out that the devil is like, no, I was justified in all of these things. I'm a liar. I'm a trickster. I have a role on earth. You should be prosecuting God. Incredible play. And so much of the carnality of those plays then seeped into the books of blood, because the short stories, like the ones that became Candyman, like Yattering and Jack, like In the Hills, the Cities, just there's so much uneasiness with the body and thinking, oh, my body couldn't do this, and then it does. And that just disquietedness. I mean, the books of blood, you open them up and they're red. I mean, that's the thing that starts all the books. It's all gruesome, but it's not about the bodies of others. It's the body yourself. And so Hellraiser, when he finally made the Hellraiser movie, and it just becomes about piecing together this thing that's been chopped apart, it's fascinating. And it's kind of beautiful. And yeah, as you say, it's a very horny movie, but Barker's work is very sexual. So... Oh.
I feel like, when you talk even like, Doug Bradley and Pinhead, the character, I always knew who Pinhead was. For a long time, I never watched his movies because just the title Hellraiser is just more than enough to be freaky. And I just never got around to it until like 3 years ago until I finally watched it. And like my eyes blew up because it was insane what I was seeing on screen. But it's weird how Pinhead is just... He fits the bill of like every like iconic 80s monster, but like he's completely different, and his movies are insanely different as well, because he's in it, but he's not in it very much. And it's not even just about him, it's about those Cenobites. It's just all of them, like the Clatterer, the very,
Butterball and
Butterball. It's, I make a joke, it's like that's how I feel sometimes. Yeah, it's just like... And plus, whatever the hell that thing was that was chasing Kirsty in the first movie.
The engineer. Yeah, the engineer. Which is not a Cenobite. So.
No, it's true. And it's like those characters, I don't know, like when I first watched this movie, like I had no idea what these Cenobites were, but like I like them so much that I don't care if I don't know much about them. And I can't think of like other like horror franchises where it's like that. Cause like, I mean, Friday the 13th, they explain who Jason is and that's fine.
Yeah.
They explain who Freddy is, you know what Michael's like. But you never really kind of get that until like the sequels, which I think is awesome that it starts building this, like this, you talked about when we were before recording, like about like in like emails, you were saying like the mythos and like the backstories, all this stuff. It's like, I had no idea that's what they were actually going to do. And like, up until the third one, they give you little breadcrumbs of like who the Pinhead character is. I think that's so cool. And then to do that in like the late 80s and also supply the awesome practical effects that look straight out of the Thing, and then some, and like these transformation scenes. It's like, how do you even put that crap on screen? Like, how do you like, I mean, the practical effect, it wasn't Tom Savini that was doing this. So, you know, the people who were doing it were incredibly talented.
Well, it's funny because so many of the American ones are quasi-revenge stories. Friday the 13th is a revenge story. Nightmare on Elm Street, absolutely, revenge story. Freddy comes back, get the kids, the people that burned him alive. So many of them are this. The Cenobites are there to bring pleasure through unending pain. And it amuses them, but it's their job. And they are beholden only to Leviathan. And as when Barker wrote Scarlet Gospels, which is the ultimately huge epic sequel to Hellbound Heart, there's a war in hell that's hinted at in Hellraiser 4 Bloodline, where you get that Pinhead likes the new way, that hell has changed. It's not immoral. It's not Lucifer's hell anymore. It's we're dedicated to sex and pain and we take it seriously. Yeah. And I mean, that's insane. How do you just say, you know what we should do? We should turn that into a movie. It was rated X. I mean, they couldn't even release the stupid thing. But people are still watching it like decades later and, you know, remaking it for streaming services. So, but yeah, you're right. It's just American horror was very normal in the franchises. Halloween, same thing. It's he comes back. Ultimately, they kind of solve it out that it's some kind of revenge thing. But it's just very, this happens and this happens. Hellraiser was just like, if you have the skills to unlock a puzzle box that was made for a French aristocrat, guess what? Demons will come with chains to grant you sexual pleasure. That's not Leprechaun. That's insane. So, and I think that's why it's held on.
I mean, yeah, the only sort of like masochist sort of thing I can like relate this to is maybe Hooper's like Texas Chainsaw Massacre. Like it doesn't explain why they kill the way they do. It's just like they just are insane and take joy in that type of thing. But even then, it's like Hellraiser just leaps and bounds above what it was, and it came out in 88, the first one, or was that 86? The first one, 87.
Made in 86, came out in America in 87. Yeah,
there you go. And yeah, you think that's the late 80s, you know what I mean? Like all the good stuff up to that point was probably released in the early half of the decade. And it, I mean, do you remember what it was like when Hellraiser was coming out, or even in the 90s? Like what was the, like, what were they talking about in Fangoria about like Hellraiser back in the day then, I guess?
Well, it was funny because Barker was such a known quantity because the first novels, like Weaverworld came out and was huge. The early novels of his Books of Blood and the early novels were big, and so and they had made one movie, Rawhead Rex, and it was fine.
Yeah.
But it wasn't. Barker was itching to direct, and it was kind of that idea of, okay, it happened. It didn't happen at a major studio, but it was give him a shot. And then the thing, because like Evil Dead, it was considered more notorious before people had even seen it, because it was X-rated, because it was seen as being so much worse than anything else. I was too young for Hellraiser, but I remember very specifically opening the newspaper to go to the funny pages and there was like an ad for Hellraiser 2. And it was like, kids not allowed, never see this. This is too awful for anything. I'm like, okay, this I have to see. It was the perfect sales thing for it. And then when Hellraiser 3 came out, I think I saw it on home video, but they did a tour. It was so big. They did a music tour of the soundtrack that came to Houston. And I think it was like KMFDM and like all these weird bands played like a dumpy club. And it was like the Hellraiser 3 Hell on Earth tour. And it probably made more money than the movie. So it's just, so by then I was finally old enough I saw Hellraiser 4 in the theater. And I think that's the only time I've ever seen an Alan Smithy film in a theater. And I think that's the last time an Alan Smithy film got a major release. So I don't think any others, there's been like 20 since then, but it takes a lot for the Guild to release a movie as Alan Smithy. And I think that was the last major release where a director was allowed to take their name off, because I think Supernova came out. Everybody took their name off that. I forget who they credit on Supernova, but I don't think it's Alan Smithy. So, and wow, when I walked in there, I was like, this is going to be amazing.
It was probably like a midnight premiere too. And like everyone like is all like ready to go.
I was the only one in the theater. Me and my friend Phil, we were like it. Nobody cared. Nobody cared about Hellraiser Bloodline. So,
that's crazy because I think, compared to the leap from 3 to 4, I think there's a better leap, if that makes sense. I think 3's all right. I appreciate that there's a band that's like centered around some of the story, because it's like any like horror movie that has a band and a longer sequence, like Gorilla Killer in 79, Howling 2, you could say Trick or Treat. I could say Singles, not a horror movie, but I love when horror movies do that, though. When they put like a band a little bit into the movie, it kind of makes it a little more fun.
Yeah. It's funny because I was thinking a lot about Hell on Earth as I was watching the new one, the Bruckner Hellraiser that just came out. Because if you remember in 3, the club owner has to feed a certain number of souls. Pinhead's trapped in the Pillar of Souls, and you have to feed a certain number of souls to the thing to free Pinhead. With the Bruckner, sorry, spoilers, but there's a very specific series of configurations. The configurations of the Le Marchand's box have always kind of been mysterious, and they really spell them out. You go from this Leviathan configuration, Lament configuration. And if you do that, adding blood each time, different victims, like a slasher film, add up to every time you kill somebody and their blood enters Le Marchand's box, it moves to a new configuration, because the ultimate configuration is to open a pathway to hell, which is from the old stories. But in this, it really is, they take the Pillar of Souls plot from Hell on Earth and put it as, well, that's also how you open Le Marchand's box. And I was like, oh, I always just thought it was like some guy was horny enough that he's going to work on that thing for a year to finally open the box and get the right configuration. The Cenobites are like, what? Finally? Oh my God, the world's horniest man, Hellraiser. But now it's like, no, kill 6 people. You will move through the configurations, and the Cenobites show up. I'm like, what about the world's horniest man? That you abandoned the mythology. So
I wonder if they kind of got rid of that eventually. I mean, I haven't read the Clive Barker books, but I know Clive Barker was very hands-on with Hellraiser for a while, up until that 4th movie. And with that, he didn't direct the second movie. I don't know how much work he actually did on that second one, on Hellbound Hellraiser 2.
A lot.
But Tony Randall did a pretty darn good job. I mean, the only other thing I see him in is Ticks, which also has a 4K Vinegar Syndrome release. So if anybody from Vinegar Syndrome is listening to that, please send a copy over my way.
Ticks.
Right? Remember Bug Horror? Remember that was such a trend, and then 8-Legged Freaks kind of killed it.
See, that's an undervalued early 80s, like with Barker. There's a book called Slugs by Sean Hudson that was made into not a great movie, but still the book is one of the greatest killer bug nonsense. Like it's gory and bloody and insane and holds up. Sean Hudson very underrated early 80s UK splatter guy. So in the bug wave that came after the rat wave.
Oh
So,
gosh, yeah. And then we had like a whole like reptile wave where you had like giant boa versus mega python or whatever type movies that came out, and CGI the hell out of those. Yeah, I love how sub horror genres have like trends in that way. And I watched all of them as a weird, early 2000s kid growing up at Family Video, basically. But
yeah, Sci-Fi Channel Saturday nights. Every Saturday night, all they needed was a 1.0 rating to justify the budgets. The budgets were like $1 million. Like, all we want's a 1.0 for Sci-Fi Channel. That meant like 5 people showed up. If they did, they're like, success for Sci-Fi. And it was always like Titanoboa, Komodo Dragon, like all of them. And there's some great movies in there. There's some awful movies in there, but there's some great, underrated, great Z-grade monster crap in there. So
I need Shudder to do like a month-long, like early 2000s, late 90s, like straight to Sci-Fi Channel. Could you imagine that?
I'd watch the whole thing. It would be like when Turner Classic Movies is doing like a Fred Astaire-a-thon, Shudder's doing like a garbage early aught sci-fi original-a-thon. I'm like, Fred Astaire, Ghost Story, and just watch the other. That would be amazing.
There you go. We have the same energy, Mark. That's why I love that. But yeah, we talk about like, he wasn't, I don't know how, you said he had a lot of presence or work done on that second movie. I mean, I don't know. It seems like he was very influential. Like we talked about last time you were on, Sam Raimi, like he's your guy and stuff like that. Sam Raimi and Evil Dead have some oddly similarities to that. Hellbound, at least with the graphic and the gore. But I wonder if that's because of David Cronenberg more, maybe from the early 80s that was like ushering that in, or is just like, did Clive Barker, when he put out Hellraiser, was like, it's just like this wave of like aspiring filmmakers and writers being like, wow, look at that. We can make money off of that. And I have ideas. So let's go do that.
And they also, I mean, when Hellraiser came out, there's that double-edged sword of, we're going to push the envelope, which means we might get banned as a video nasty from home video release in certain places. Home video mom and pop video stores in America, Blockbuster, could not carry X-rated films. Okay. But if you make a movie that's so notorious like that, like an Evil Dead or like a Hellraiser, people are going to fight to see the thing. So there's that, we're not going to get in theaters. We're not going to get in Blockbuster. But we are going to get millions of people to seek out Hellraiser because it's exactly what Barker wanted to do on a pretty low budget. So.
Yeah. I wonder if that's like what we see now with movies. Like you see a lot of movies like, you see it all the time, Vigoria or like, Dead of Nerds, whatever, all these websites. So-and-so highly anticipated movie is now being reported to be a PG-13 movie, and then you see all this like, oh my gosh, it's ruining the thing, and then everyone says, why can't everything be rated R? But I wonder if because the rated R label now is now going to be for that reason, like you said, it might make us less accessible, but if we can get enough of a following, it will, the returns will come in the long run. I wonder if we're kind of doing that now.
Well, that's part of the problem. There is no aftermarket anymore with no Blockbuster, no home video market. Home video is so niche at this point. You used to be able to rely on, we'll sell some to Blockbuster. And by selling some to Blockbuster, that's, even if it's one copy, that's 3,000 stores. And if you're number one at the box office, they used to buy 100. So that was such a huge part of the financial pie for any movie. Now that there's no aftermarket, and streaming services pay nothing, it's very PG-13 horror is maybe we'll get enough people in theaters. And now with COVID, you never know. But it's really hard to make profits. You make your money back, but it's really hard for people to make profits on horror films anymore. And then you do something so original, like a Malignant or something that's just out there that people are like, you have to see this. I'm not telling you you're going to love it. I'm not telling you you're going to hate it. What I'm saying is you got to see it. And so everybody saw Malignant and it made a lot of money. So what you're saying is probably true. If you make something so outre, you make something so bananas that you have to engage with the film, maybe that's success in this day and age.
So where are you at, Mark? In the Twitter discourse for the last year, where do you stand on the Malignant argument?
Oh, I think it's great. I still like Identity. I mean, I love when it's like, oh my God, they're all in his brain and they're in a motel and it's all fake. I'm like, from the director of Jack Frost. I'm like, this is amazing to me. I love that. I will never not be a B movie guy. And Malignant was such a B movie twist movie. Like, they're not going to do this. They did it. And you're just like, great. I love when people have the chutzpah to do something absurd. So I thought Malignant was great.
Okay. Let me hear that, everyone. Mark Water, he's a Malignant guy.
It's
Malignant.
great.
That's good.
You're not? You're like, nah, no way.
Okay, so they call it a giallo and all these other things. You hear all about this stuff. But for me, it's just like the odd music placement. Like, it's James Wan. You know, I know James Wan likes to have a good time. I love his X-Files episodes. When those were always really good ones. And he seems like he made a lot of his money with the big box office stuff, so he got to just do Malignant. And I love the twist and I love the third act, but like it felt like such a chore to get to that point. And I think with the pacing and like the odd like human elements of it. But you know what?
The art house horror pacing.
Exactly.
That's killing some people now. Yeah.
Is it the A24 effect? I think is what I like to call it.
I will never say that aloud, but it's absolutely the A24 effect. But it's fine. I mean, there's so much horror being made that if you don't like that, there's something else right here. I mean, it just
pretty much.
I mean, there's so much stuff. So, and the only bad thing, and this is actually to bring it back to Hellraiser Bloodline, the one thing that's kind of a bummer in horror right now in horror films is you see movies that you're like, wow, the best version of this movie would be a $20 million New Line movie or something, like to really realize what this filmmaker is going for. And then they end up having to make it for 1.8 somewhere. And so you can see the ideas, you can see, and I'm not going to mention any names because that's rude, but you can see what an interesting premise and what the filmmaker really wanted to accomplish, but they're just not able to get there because it's such a crapshoot to make that money back now. So
and you talk about like there's not money in the aftermarket. If like directors or producers want to put that stuff out, they basically have to put it in the home media section. Like you see like that extended editions, director's cuts, which, you know, then boutique labels will eat that up, right? And then put out like a second release. Like remember when Exorcist came out, the version you've never seen before, but they just put in the edited out like spider walk scene. And the ending is a Casablanca ending. And then
and they added the little special effects of like you suddenly see the face and you're like, no, I mean, I get it, but no. So
and
it's
I mean, I don't know.
effective on its own.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure you've been around and you've seen it so much now, especially with independent films too. It's like I don't know where it almost becomes like configuring the little box in Hellraiser, trying to figure out which version of movies to watch, especially in horror movies. Like, do you watch a director's cut? Do you watch like the theatrical cut? Like, how do you even navigate that anymore? It's like I always forget which version of Alien to watch sometimes, but then it's like I trust Ridley Scott in his like, you know, reproduction of his old movies, but then you get things like Exorcist 3 where you can't figure out they're completely different movies, and it gets almost confusing to figure out. And I wonder if it's because the movies were supposed to be completely different and that's the movie we were supposed to get, but the studios get in the way and kind of say, no, we don't want that, or I don't like that. I mean, you see with Warner Brothers all the time now, like changing movies completely. And I wonder if that was such a thing in the late 80s, early 90s, up to the 2000s even.
Well, that's what Hellraiser Bloodline is a perfect example of that, where Peter Atkins, who is a collaborator of Barker's, wrote this script, and is almost like 3 distinct chapters of, you're going to do a story that's in the past about the invention of Lamar Box. You're going to do one in the center that's contemporary with Lamar Shawn's descendant as an architect, and then the futuristic one where they build a satellite. But in the actual script, it was like a meteor, and they built a sun around it, and there's no happy ending in the old script. And Atkins did it very much with the blessing of Barker, like really expanded out what should have been I guess in those dollars, like a $20-30 million movie, to really realize the stuff. And in the Lamar Shawn's box, the French sequence was longer, and Atkins, who's also the big force behind the Wishmaster franchise, has done so much. Like, I saw there was a musical version of Wishmaster, Jen the musical, and he did this in like one church 20 years ago, and he was in it. Atkins was in it playing a clown, and he sang songs. I was there. It was great. It has never been done since. But it a lot of the Commedia dell'arte like kind of stuff that was taken out by the Weinsteins from Hellraiser Bloodline is all over the script. There was all these commentary of these kind of demonic kind of chorus of what Lamar Shawn was doing. There was so much more in the French plotline in Hellraiser Bloodline that really defined how hell was evolving. The hell that Angelique was a princess of hell who's born into it in the first chapter has been having this lusty carnal existence for 200 years when she meets the Hell Priest, when she meets Pinhead, and he's like, and in the original script, he's like, hell has changed. Things have changed. There is a new order. And all of that's gone because Dimension was like, we don't need any of that. Nobody cares about that crap. And they just focused on Pinhead as Boogeyman, and they kept bringing him in earlier. There's a lot that you can tell about what Dimension didn't understand about the Hellraiser franchise based on the cuts to Hellraiser Bloodline. And absolutely, it makes sense that the director took his name off of it and was like, I just don't feel I mean, I've seen directors keep their name on things for much less, for stuff that they had nothing. I've seen movies that you're like, you didn't make any of that, but there's the director. This guy was like, I don't feel comfortable. This is not what I signed on to do. So he took his name off, and it's, he could have kept it on. I don't, was clearly his decision, but it was a bridge too far. And Barker did kind of walk away. And then Hellraiser, after Hellraiser Bloodline was a disaster financially, Inferno and all the sequels become, as we were talking before we started recording, very low budget movies. And in a couple of cases, scripts that were repurposed to be Hellraiser movies. And it almost feels like Dimension was just keeping the license. There's a reason in the new Hellraiser, and this might be a little too inside baseball, but when you see Mark Toberoff's name in the credits of a movie, like he is on the new Hellraiser, he's a lawyer. And when there's disputed rights on things, he goes after the rights. He's been working on the Jack Kirby estate stuff. If you just go on IMDb and you look at Mark Toberoff, you'll see all these disputed stuff, and he basically will help you get the rights back if he then is a producer and gets like 30%. Like, I'm shocked he's not part of the Friday the 13th case.
I was about to say he belongs to be in there.
He belongs. He probably went after it, but Toberoff is on a lot of these movies with disputed rights issues, and it just. Maybe that means going forward, there will no longer be Hellraiser movies that are just, we have to put one out this year, otherwise we lose the rights. I mean, Dimension was a weird place.
Yeah, this is backpedal just a little bit because those are really cool things, but it's like, why don't you get him to freaking visit the guy who owns the rights to the Dawn of the Dead from '78 and get a decent U.S. release of that movie, right?
I'll bet he's on it. You never, when you're reading Variety and you suddenly see something, you're like, wow, I thought that would, and then you go down, you're like, Mark Toberoff producing. He's been on this for 3 years. So
we'll see if we'll ever get that Friday the 13th. Anyway, but Yeah, a Dimension, growing up, I remember the Dimension logo, the Dimension like opening for movies and stuff like that.
Yeah.
And you talk about the way it was, I can't even remember, was it Miramax or was it Dimension that was even working on Wes Craven's Scream movies in the 90s? I always get those two confused for some reason. And I wonder,
it's the same company, it's just the genre label of Miramax. So
no kidding.
Yeah, it's the Weinstein brothers, Harvey and Bob Weinstein. Bob ran Dimension, Harvey ran Big Miramax, and Bob oversaw theatrical stuff like The Faculty, and then straight-to-video stuff like the Children of the Corn sequels, and just that endless parade of when they got their first deal, they made this huge overarching deal. Again, this might be boring as shit, but they made this huge overarching deal with Blockbuster to release X amount of movies per month. And Blockbuster held shelf space for movies that Miramax or Dimension would release per month. And that could be acquisitions from film festivals. That could be Dimension straight-to-video action movies. That could be Dimension straight-to-video horror films. They had a pipeline, and they had to fill it. And Dimension just kept churning out movies. And Miramax kept acquiring movies. There was at one point, they had something like 50 movies backlogged that they couldn't even release. So Blockbuster Video was getting movies that might have been at Cannes 4 or 5 years earlier. Wow. And it's just because they were so backlogged that Miramax would be like, okay, finally this movie can come up. And Dimension was doing endless. And I mean, Artisan was in that business with like Leprechaun, and sometimes they come back for more.
Yeah.
That model of, we have an output deal with Blockbuster, we have TV deals with syndication, and we have foreign rights sold into European television. You could make a movie. So, and you could make it in bulk. So that was Dimension's deal for a very long time.
Makes sense. That's why they'd open up I think it was like a subgroup of Dimension where they called it Dimension Extreme, and it was just, I think, straight to DVD. Because like even like one of the Hellraiser movies was slapped with the label Dimensions Extreme, or it was like Dimension Midnight or something like that. And then you got
one of those
like
labels that comes up and go like Rogue. You still see like, oh yeah, Rogue. Back when Focus had a label. It was there for like 6 months, and then I think one of the Edgar Wright movie, Shaun of the Dead might be Rogue.
Yeah.
Or Hoffa's might be Rogue. It was one of those genre labels that was there and gone.
Yeah, it's like like a spooky intro, and it's like, well, this movie's gonna be fucking awesome. It's crazy. I mean, I remember
Screen
that.
Gems in the age of Underworld. Yeah, like, and then they're gone.
Yeah, I mean, when you were working in the 90s and stuff like that had to keep you busy, like, watching these movies, or even just as a movie fan, like you had to have loved like the output that the studios were putting out there,
I would love to say no, it was terrible. I'm like, nah, I watched like Dimension could put anything out. I loved watching Dimension movies. It was just, you could, any number of Children of the Corn movies, I was going to watch that Children of the Corn movie. So it's just, it didn't matter what it was. I love
Children of the Corn Genesis. Gotta love that one.
And have you seen the new one?
I haven't.
The Kurt Wimmer one?
No. I just remember Dimensions putting those movie 4-packs on Blu-rays constantly.
That was weird when they started because then you could tell the market was kind of shifting a little bit when they just started doing those like 10 movies on one DVD, and you're like, we're no longer selling to Blockbuster, we're selling to Walmart end caps. So it changed the way DVDs were sold because you had such smaller shelf space at Walmart. You have like a row and an end cap. So you better pour everything into one because you don't have the whole store like Blockbuster. So you have those little packs for truck stops and for Walmart and all the places where you don't have much shelf space.
Yeah, and then New Line Cinema did the 4 film favorites, like trying to copy Dimensions 4-packs. Yeah, that's how they released all those Friday or Nightmare on Elm Street movies. They got the first 4, the good ones, in a DVD pack, and then you had to buy the other, crappy ones on the other 4 movie pack. But that might be slandering Dream Child a little too much, though. So, but yeah,
as a Friday the 13th person, slander away. I got in so many fights on the elementary school playground, being like, "I love Jason." Everybody's like, "You're an idiot. We love Freddy," and you're just like, "Really, really." Everybody's a Freddy fan. I was the only Jason fan I knew. So.
I think when I was younger, I'll always be a Freddy kid, but like the older I'm getting, I'm starting to become a Jason guy.
Yeah.
Like I really am.
Come
like
to the dark side.
Yeah.
The hand of God. The unmotivated, the whole world is my mother's killer. So you just gotta kill the world. Freddy's like, no, I have a specific kill list. And it has to be the bloodline of the people that burned me alive. And you're like, okay. And I'm gonna do crazier lines and crazier gags. Yeah. Jason's like, nope, just here to kill you. Like,
yeah. That's probably why they're probably taking so damn long to do Nightmare on Elm Street movies, because they're trying to think of some intricate way of bringing Freddy back to haunt Elm Street again. Is what I haven't watched the remake from 2000 and I think 11 is when it came out. It couldn't have been. I haven't watched it since it first came out. It couldn't have been that bad, where we just haven't gotten a Blu-ray release or a new movie, right?
Well, it's funny because what they almost did when they almost said Freddy wasn't a child molester, he was wrongfully burned alive. When it looked like that was going to be the movie, I was like, holy shit. And they're like, no, he's a child molester. You're like, oh, okay. But when it looked like they were going to change the mythology that much, I was kind of on board. I was kind of like, that's really strange. It's not like Freddy versus Jason, where Jason's afraid of water. And you're like, I don't buy that. Yeah. It was such a weird way to reinvent Nightmare on Elm Street. I was like, why not? So,
yeah. My latest take after Rob Zombie's Monsters is I need Richard Brake to be cast as Freddy Krueger, and I need him to be that. That's my latest take. Anyway, back to iconic, Rob Zombie kind of goes into that whole like late 90s, early 2000s type of directors and like creatives like McFarlane and Barker, and you get like those Silent Hill movies. You get Rob Zombie, you can throw into that mix. It's just a weird time. And then you throw Blade in there too. Definitely kind of feels like that in some ways too.
Well, Zombie had colors. His music videos were colorful. And horror was all dark and like it was just, there was so much unlit. And then he comes and brings this like psychedelic feel into his music videos. And you're like, wow, no one's doing that version of, horror just with the videos. And then when he starts making the movies and they're all textured and they're all shot like late 70s films, it's like, that's really interesting. I still think his Halloween 2 is just the most underrated Halloween film in the whole franchise. So Mark, I love the first one. No, but Rob Zombie's Halloween 2, full on white horse nightmare shit. I'm like, Rob Zombie's Halloween 2. That's what it makes so much sense. It's so weird. It's
like weird. He tricked the studios into doing an art house film, and it's that's awesome.
And it works, and it's brutal. It's horrifically brutal. So.
Yeah. Well, go back and rewatch our episode that we talked about with Halloween 2 from Rob Zombie. I think you'd really like that then. And then when we talk about Hellraiser 4 Bloodline, we talked about it a little bit. It kind of goes back. It starts in the future first off. It's in 2165 or something crazy. And it's spaceships and everything. The CGI is actually not that bad. But I think some people right off the bat, when they think about Hellraiser 4, they're like, oh, it's this horror franchise that has to go into space because so many other horror franchises up to this point had. But it's actually, from a story standpoint, makes a lot of sense, and it's kind of cool to see. And then you get like a rip-off Terminator in a little bit of that opening too. But like for the fourth movie, I mean, you think about, Friday the 13th Part 4, Nightmare 4, Halloween 4. I mean, it holds up with the fours of the horror franchises, in my opinion. I'll talk about the story a little bit more in a little bit, but just right off the bat, I would say when you think about iconic fours in horror movies, I think Hellraiser is definitely worthy of talking about.
Well, it goes so much into like the actual creation of the box is referenced in Hellbound Heart. It's in that they talk about it being built by a French toy maker for a French aristocrat. But it's kind of written off in a paragraph, and you get the idea that, the aristocrat must be a Marquis de Sade or Gilles Zarai, the werewolf guy who was a child murderer, was definitely based on one of those really strange, actual real life French aristocrats from the era who was obsessed with magic and was obsessed with perverting Christianity. The way Desaad is both misunderstood and completely understood. He was nuts, but so much was a reaction to his time and his position. And so he's actually a really interesting person. So making Le Marchand create a box for essentially somebody who is just trying to push sadism and pleasure as far as he can was fascinating. And you don't get that in the films until the fourth one. And it's weird to see Le Marchand's box being created only 200 years before the present day, because in the books, the engineer is seen as like 1,000,000 years old and is the first person to open the gateways to hell. So there's a much bigger history, but the idea, at least finally explaining how somebody would create a lacquered box that could open a gateway to hell was really interesting. And it just, so there was still stuff to mine when you're doing Bloodline. There's still unexplored aspects from the original story that make it into Hellraiser Bloodline. And again, that's why I wanted to talk about this one, because that ends. That stops after part 4. And it feels that there are a lot of loose ends in 4 that you could keep exploring, that you could have gone into a much more Clive Barker type Hellraiser 5. And that just wasn't in the cards. There's still so much there in the book.
Yeah, there's so much lore just in that whole, 17th century France, setting there. We see the toy maker, and they call him toy maker throughout most of the movie, tinkering with this thing. And then you get a young Adam Scott in this movie from Parks and Rec as well. You get an awesome scene with Angelique, who is one of the film's antagonists as well. Which I guess she's the first victim to the box, and you see what happens to her, and she also lives as well after that occurrence.
The demon Angelique, the princess of hell, then is now inside the body of the peasant they sacrificed to functionally Leviathan. Right. So she's now her body is possessed by the princess. So,
and that is so dark and so insane to even think about. And then they put that in and put it in a 1700s, setting. That makes you think about like all the atrocities that's going on in the 1700s, especially in France and stuff like that. And then they throw the occult in there. That's crazy. And then the aristocrats, the
decadence of the aristocrats, just pushing the boundaries of what they could get away with, because you could get away with anything. Desaad, time and time again, got away with unspeakable crimes, unspeakable acts as he sought sexual pleasure. And he was thrown in jail. He's thrown in jail in Spain. He's thrown in jail in France, but he kept escaping because he was of a class that the king just didn't feel worthy of death. Like, we can't really punish him. He's one of us. So time and time again, Desaad kind of skated, and his mother-in-law was kind of like, but he's horrible. But he just kept kind of skating. And that's kind of the milieu that you have this puzzle box be a part of. It doesn't feel so far removed from something that might have happened in the court of Desaad at one of his houses.
So true. And if it makes sense, like, and up until this point, the people who are handling the box or, trying to summon the Cenobites and stuff like that, they're people who like would belong in quote unquote hell if you're religious as well, or like want to tamper and align themselves with that sort of superpower and such, or that's supernatural. So it only makes sense in the 1700s where it starts off that's the case. And I love the fact that the toy maker is so oblivious to the fact of he's creating this thing and has no idea. And then he goes and he sees all this stuff and tries to make an anti-box as well, which is first time mentioned as well. Never gets it done, and then you hop back into the 2000s and you see his descendant, which what I like about it is it kind of places perfectly right after the third movie, where in the third movie you see all these business Wall Street guys, I'm assuming,
right?
Going to this building that's designed exactly like the box and the interior, and it's like it explores that even more. And oh my gosh, I love that little kind of like callback to the last movie, and then tying it into this kind of, like you said, contemporary time of like where that's going on. And Angelique is still doing her own thing. It's really interesting to see that, you know, you never saw that before, that she's living amongst the humans and like doing whatever she pleases, and no one has ever
pleasure. Yeah,
exactly. No one really kind of could, no crimes, no forensics or anything to say there's some serial killer or demonic thing coming out. She's just doing her own thing. I find that very interesting. But then we get introduced to, for most of the movie, the Toymaker's lineage up to that point, which I think is cool. And then you get his, I think it's his mother or his wife, I can't remember again, who Kim Myers' character was.
Oh, yeah.
But
yeah,
Kim Myers,
the mother is his kid. Yeah.
There you go. The wife, yeah. And the fact that Kim Myers is in this, Kim Myers, who to me is, you know, royalty in the horror genre because of Nightmare 2.
Nightmare, yeah.
I mean, she's in this and she's doing a really good performance, and the kid in this movie. I love the part where it shows Angelique, you know, realizing that the Toymaker is part of the lineage because she's been around for 200 years now. She tries to get, I don't know if she purposely tries to summon Pinhead or not, but she gets this guy to play with the box and then just sacrifice him. And I'm like, oh, I love this. You know, like here's someone who knows how to use the box and know what the fuck they're doing with it. And you get this awesome intro. It almost feels like a hero shot. You see Pinhead come in, and I'm like, I hope in every movie in the franchise, Pinhead has like this grandiose, you know, introduction. Yeah. It feels very different from when he was first shown in the first movie or even the second movie and how he is in this one.
It's funny because that's another thing you were saying. It reminded me in Bloodline, the building becoming a trap and then the satellite becoming a trap. Always, when I first saw it, I was like, oh, it's like the Winchester Mansion, the lore around the Winchester Mansion. You have to create a house that the ghosts cannot escape. Because it's so stairs leading to nowhere, doors leading three-story door. If you actually go to the Winchester Mansion, it's just a big, ugly, overbuilt house. But the idea behind it is really interesting, that you're tricking something non-human into mistaking where they are and never being able to leave. And I love that idea of the descendants of Le Marchand using that, I guess, genetic memory. They don't really explain it, but the idea that it's in the bloodline, that they will be able to take the inverse of Le Marchand's box as a gate and be able to create a trap. And that idea is fantastic in Bloodline. And you have to build them huge and cosmic. It can't be a small little box. It has to be a skyscraper, or it has to be a space platform. And that huge out-of-the-box thinking is one of the things that I love about Peter Atkins with the script of Hellraiser Bloodline, because that's crazy. That's a really interesting idea that you couldn't have done in Le Marchand's time. You could not, in late 1700s France, that solution to the problem, the technology didn't exist yet. So you have this, so we're going to attempt it in the 90s. We're going to attempt the idea of building a skyscraper, Le Marchand's box. It's not going to work. So in the future, when you can capture perpetual light bouncing off each other, as Le Marchand postulated, you just had to wait 3 centuries before the technology existed to make something that could trap the Cenobites. And that is such an amazing horror idea. That is really cool. And they could have used $10 more to execute it as a better visual. But it just, I love, that's the Barker thinking. That's that, or the Peter Atkins thinking. That humongous idea of making this cosmic and making this so much bigger than a very earthbound, very Freddy versus Jay, like the kind of other horror that was going on at the time. It's a stab at making cosmic horror. And then when Barker wrote the sequel book, when he wrote Scarlet Gospels, and half the book is a sequel to Lord of Illusions with Harry D'Amour's character, and half of it is a sequel to Hellbound Heart, where you have the Hell Priest, Pinhead, kind of summoning an army across hell to finally conquer hell. What he's trying to do is what was in Hellraiser Bloodline. It's kind of hidden there, where It was in the script, kind of cut from the movie, but a new order in hell is so much a part of what Barker himself would later make as a sequel to say, yes, this is about a new order of demons remaking hell as they want to see it and killing Lucifer. So that was a part of Bloodline at some point. But Barker's stuff, even in Undying, we mentioned the video game, Undying, his unproduced American Horror script, Galilee, which is an underrated novel of his, he's obsessed with lineages. He's obsessed with like Kennedy's style families in multiple generations. Undying is all about that. Undying is like Encanto, but with, you know, the tortured souls figures from McFarlane. All these people in a house with different powers, and they're all awful. So I like that about that. But then that's all gone after Bloodline.
Right. And then that is a good point, because like if Barker is so obsessed with making, you know, the Hell Priest Pinhead be this sort of like ambitious figure in hell, it would make sense why when it shows Angelique and him, you know, reuniting and the way he acts when he sees her, they have like a lot of quarrels throughout the movie, and it's very interesting to see how the old mindset and like a newer adjusting mindset have to work together, because it's like when you make a movie about something like hell and like about torturing people, you know, hell is basically it's a concept of like the times. So like obviously 1700s French idea of hell in like in a Catholic sense there is going to be completely different in like the 20th century. And the fact that Pinhead is trying to adjust that for the sake of like keeping up with the times is so awesome, because it's like, look at what the fuck people are doing now in 1996, you know. And it's
true.
like,
He's the Patrick Bateman Cenobite. Angelique is the Marquis de Sade Cenobite. So she's still the Marie Antoinette. So yeah, I guess you're right. It's true. He's very much like order and leather. And like Angelique's like, I've had sex for 200 years with Adam Scott. We're good. But he's like, no, your old ways. That's what's weird. There's a new Puritanism in hell as led by Pinhead, that's hinted at in the script. It's hinted at in the film. But that would have been an amazing movie. Then it becomes not just multiple generations of Le Marchand trying to stop the Cenobites. You track an evolution of Pinhead as well. Dimension, I don't think ever understood who Pinhead was. And I like the idea that you could have used the same movie to track how the Cenobites change over the years as they respond to the new demands of humanity in response to what they are doing in hell. And because it's all about Le Marchand. And it would be really interesting if it had focused more on that relationship and focused more on Pinhead's frustrations. What's a bad day at the office for old Pinhead? But then Barker goes into it in Scarlet Gospels.
Right.
Like,
I definitely
prefer
Pinhead in this one. Just basically cut the bullshit. I know what I want. I know how to get to it. Because you kind of tackled in 2 and 3 the whole idea of Pinhead remembering who he was and bargaining and like tiptoeing around this unsaid, you know, authority in hell. In the second movie with Leviathan not actually being shown, just kind of like this penis monster thing attached to this doctor's body, which pretty damn cool, I'm not gonna lie. But like, you know, the way he dies and then is brought back in the third one, it's kind of like, okay, we got his backstory with Vietnam and stuff like that. It makes sense why, you know, he wants to torture people. But in the fourth one, it kind of gets back to basics, and it feels like a more.
The Elliot Spencer stuff is gone from 4, and I respect that. I never bought into that. It was never my favorite part of it.
I always thought it was like,
makes it too contemporary.
Yeah, and I thought I thought they did that because like Doug Bradley in his contract said, I got to not be in my Pinhead makeup in some points during the movie.
Yeah, Bradley's a tremendous. It's funny because it always makes me think of Hawkins and when he played Hannibal across multiple movies. There's just such a weight. Bradley, because he worked with Barker on so many projects, he knows exactly what he's being asked to do. There is not a big change from composer to conductor. He knows what this character is because he helped create him. And he really understands that. So no matter how far you get into the sequels, Doug Bradley is always right there delivering what he's meant to do. And sometimes it's the worst dialogue you've ever heard, but it's still, he delivers it with that just gravity that you're like, oh yeah, remember when this guy was, you know, doing insane stuff in the Hellraiser franchise. It's like Tony Todd. Tony Todd has been asked to do certain weird things across multiple franchises, but he still brings that weight. And that's why I always liked him when he came back and did little things in Final Destination, because I liked him as I liked Bloodworth. I liked him as the mortician because he added a lot of weight to that franchise. The way Bradley, I don't know if he would have had, I mean, obviously they had 2 Hellraiser sequels without Bradley, but it just, I don't know. He really, in 4, when he shows up, I don't think he's particularly used very well, but he just, it's fun to see him there. It's fun to see him back in the makeup. But it is, as we're talking about, I'm like, it is kind of one of the weaker, there could have been so much more with his character in that.
Yeah,
if they had followed the script.
Yeah, he just seems like he's more interested in showing Angelique off, like, I can do this with torture now versus what you're doing. And it's like, where's the, I'm going to rip your soul apart, you know, where's this other, you know, aspect of it? Although I do love the stuff where when he hears humans literally say like, oh my God, or like, what in God's, and he's like, why are you asking me my thoughts on that? You know, I kind of like that. Like,
do I look like someone who cares what God thinks? It's one of the great lines of Bloodline. Yeah. It's funny because he does, it's funny, and Pinhead is funny. I mean, because he's so arrogant, and there's such a, but he's still a servant, which is weird because the Bruckner Hellraiser, the Hulu one, leans into that idea you called us here. What do you want? This is a bargain. You want something. We're here to give it to you. It's not easy to get us here. What do you want? And Pinhead always it felt like Pinhead in the earlier Hellraiser movies always understood that humans are not ready for what's on offer. And in the new one, it's much more spelled out. But it always seemed like Pinhead's like, what do you mean you didn't want your face ripped apart with chains? That's literally, that's here on the Applebee's menu. That's most popular. That's what we do. We are the Cenobites. We put chains in your face. That's our thing. That's our shtick. Yeah. And it's just so weird. His arrogance feels like it's born of several humans solving LaMarchand's box and not being like, yeah, time for the change, but being like surprised. So he's just like, these idiots again.
Yeah, and he kind of shows that he can read people's fears and their thoughts, like he did with the 2 twin cops. And he's like, I know you two don't want to lose each other. What a great sequence, though. I mean, just the idea of turning
ugly. Yeah, it's amazing. So
this movie was definitely more creative with the way it transforms the body and with suffering. In the first 2 movies, it's like, I don't know. I was trying to explain it to my partner, and she was like, why do they solve this box? And it's like ultimate pain and pleasure. And it's like, maybe they get off on this idea of pain, but then the back burner thing is that we also have to suffer, which is obviously getting the hooks ripping flesh out instead of something, it's like this very human and scary thing that we, I'm not, kink shaming or anything like that, but this very scary idea of you go into your pleasures a little too far that they can now turn to pain. And that's what's so cool about the Pinhead character and this idea of hell, that hell isn't this fire and brimstone. It's not this Dante's Inferno type of hell either. It's more or less like a hell of the mind of sorts.
Yeah.
And I don't know if that was...
This movie is coming out during the AIDS crisis. I mean, this is a movie about sexual pleasure leading to impossible body pain. And it's such, I don't know if anybody, I'm sure somebody's written the essay about that at this point, but the Hellraiser that exists in response to the AIDS crisis, worldwide AIDS crisis, about finally you have the sexual evolution in the 60s. finally you have decriminalization, at least in America, not in the UK, of homosexuality. And then the sentence is, then the AIDS crisis comes. And that was a big part of Larry Kramer's play, Normal Heart, of just that, like, we have sexual freedom and we have like rights and we have all this. And then AIDS comes and it's like, fuck you. And so the AIDS crisis, as reflected in Hellraiser, of pleasure seekers finding death, is such a, it feels like an spoken, underwritten about aspect of the undercurrent of people's at least responses to Hellraiser as coming from Clive Barker, who wrote at a time as a gay man himself, wrote about, wrote gay characters at a time when that just wasn't done in horror. In the Hills of the Cities is one of the great horror stories. The leads are also a gay couple, and that's not really the kind of thing that Scribner's was putting out in every B. Dalton and Walden books in the 1980s. Mm-hmm. So that undercurrent in Hellraiser with the pleasure and pain is a thing that might have gotten lost since we're watching it now years removed from the AIDS crisis, or that form of the AIDS crisis. But it came out right at that time, and it came out from a gay director. And it was, I don't know, it was a bit revolutionary in a way that people weren't able to talk about at the time. So,
and I wonder
how much people who knew us there knew.
Right. And I wonder like how much of that was taken from the original script and like changed, or was that not even part of it in the first place, is what I'm more curious to even know about. Because this movie sounds like there was so many, like you keep saying, there's so many things that were missing. And I don't know if it's because Dimension was just like, that's too expensive, or because they thought that wasn't going to make money, or, you know, we talk about bashing studios like Warner Brothers today and stuff like that. And it's like, I wonder if they just didn't want to do that, which, you know, you don't hear anything about Dimensions anymore. And it's like, I wonder how much would play into that.
Yeah, because Harvey's on trial for rape out here in LA. Mm-hmm. And Bob has disappeared because of, he knew, allegedly knew. The thing with Bloodline very specifically was, this big script. It was like Barker wrote the script, American Horror for New Line. Okay. And it was like a $40 million script. And it was weird. And it's what he ultimately kind of half turned into his maze that was at Universal Horror, the theme park for Halloween. But Hellraiser 4 just needed more money. Hellraiser 4, you had all these big sequences. You had the French sequence was a lot longer. The doctor who you see cutting up the cadaver is in a lot more. He's killed by the demonic clowns. There's all these other pieces that would have been a bigger movie. And it didn't have a happy ending in the same way where, we're on the spaceship and we're out.
Yep.
It wasn't that kind of film. And I think that at a certain point, they made a decision. Do we want to take a chance? Or do we say, Hellraiser 3 didn't do that well. We like the script. We'll greenlight it. But we're going to cut all this stuff down from the script. It's not even going to get filmed because all the stuff in the script isn't even there. There is no director's cut that will ever exist of Hellraiser Bloodline. And so just kind of let's slot it into what Hellraiser would become. A straight to video, super cheap, every other year kind of Dimension release that will pay Doug Bradley 3 days, we'll give him a day rate. He'll come in, do the makeup, say scary shit, and leave. And sadly, it feels like they made that decision about halfway through Bloodline, where they're like, you know what? We're going to cut this down. We're going to save some money. We will probably make the same amount of money from releasing a chopped up version as the version that they wanted to make. So we'll save the money on the budget. We'll make the same amount back. And then we'll switch from a theatrical series and just go straight to tape. And that sadly is what happened ultimately to Bloodline. So it's too bad.
Yeah, it's crazy how like these big rich studios and production companies wanted to save on a few dollars, you know. But then again, I don't know how big it was money wise in the 90s, in the mid to late 90s back then too. I mean, you think about 1996, you know, Titanic, you know, I think broke records for smashing the box office record, and it had this huge budget and stuff like that. And then it's like, money was becoming such a big thing. And then I feel like money in studios was a big thing in the 90s compared to the 80s, when a lot of these franchises were just getting started and making a lot of money. And then the studios' return on that is like, yeah, F you. Like, we're just going to, corporate machine this thing. Maybe this is what Nirvana was and Kurt Cobain was saying all those times in the grunge era.
Well, it was different when your movies were only ever going to go straight to video. When in the 80s, when you're making movies almost specifically for an aftermarket and you're doing super low budget stuff, and it's crazy. It's like Bob Shea and New Line taking chances on Nightmare. And by the 90s, when you start having Lord of the Rings money and you become this proper studio where you have shareholders that need profits, you're not Avco Embassy being like, we should release Phantasm. You're no longer driven, these tiny little companies. They were basically distributors putting $10 on weird acquisitions like Phantasm or Evil Dead and just kind of releasing them and hoping they can do a region, because you didn't also have to go day and day. You could regionally release things, and so you don't have to make as many prints. You're doing nothing on advertising, and you're going to make something back on video. In the 90s, it becomes much more corporate, and because all of these studios, New Line becomes a division of Time Warner. Dimension starts buying up all these franchises. Artisan starts buying up all these franchises, and you just have these factories that just churn them out. And what's weird is sometimes you got good movies. Sometimes you had an interesting director who knew how to approach knew how to do a low budget film, and there's good stuff there. A lot of the times you didn't. So, and you just get these movies that feel like they were shot in a week and a half. So,
and I wonder how that felt for like the directors and these creatives who had to adjust to that. So how did Wes Craven adjust to that? Coming in from the 70s to the 80s, and then in the 90s doing the Scream movies. Obviously, they were very successful. I wonder if how much of the game had changed to that point and how he approached that. And you think about like Sam Raimi, like we talked about, he was kind of more of the independent scene, obviously, but you get these guys who were like big. To me, it feels like they were big head honchos in like the 80s, because it felt like make something and it's gonna, if it has a following at the blockbuster, it's gonna build a reputation and we'll get money and be able to do these things. And then like now in the 90s, it's like the game has changed now and I have to play nice, but do I still get to do my artistic side of it? I wonder. And I mean, I like to call it the MCU effect, right?
Yeah.
As long as you
Craven, which you say, I mean, he did the Scream movies, and Miramax is like, okay, we'll let you do Music of the Heart, his violin movie with Meryl Streep. Like, Craven wanted to do other things. He was a very smart guy. He was a professor. He was a very educated guy. And by the late 80s, he wasn't like, people weren't knocking on his door. And then he gets Scream, and it just changes everything. But not always, but because Scream made money. It's once you do that, I mean, that's the difference between some of the guys who I thought were really great in the 80s, like the guy who made The Hidden, like Shoulder or something. I mean,
Jack Shoulder,
great movies.
Right?
Yeah, Jack Shoulder, who did Nightmare 2, who did really good movies, but never didn't survive from the video era. I mean, we were talking about who was on Supernova, Jack Shoulder, one of the directors of Supernova. Who didn't quite survive into the corporate 90s, who weren't able to take notes, who didn't want somebody else cutting their films, and weren't like Joe Dante, who could go to DreamWorks and kind of be protected, go to Warner's and kind of be protected. You just had a lot of these crazy directors go off and make the Mangler. So it's you just kind of fall off. And it's too bad.
Yeah. And I wonder how much, I remember a year ago you were telling me about how a lot of these scripts, a lot of these cuts of movies they had done, but then studios were like, we're not going to do it. So they just the reels just get thrown out and stuff like that. I wonder how much bits and pieces of those movies had to suffer because of that, I guess, big, low indie, boom of the 90s. When you think about Hellraiser 4, likely had a franchise tag, but it was built off the shoulders of very low budget, very creative minds, and it just caught an audience to just get to a fourth movie. I haven't seen any of them up to the fourth movie, to be honest, yet. Although I'm cautiously optimistic into visiting that. And I wonder, was that kind of the what is it called? The writing on the wall for some of these, creators. Like, yeah, I could do this really awesome thing, and I'll probably get one or two good movies, but then it's like somebody's gonna give me a lot of money, and then they're just gonna go ship it off, and then it's gonna be almost not what I wanted it ever to be.
Like what happened toward like John Carpenter when he was doing stuff again for like with vampires, and you're just kind of not seeing all the time what you wanted to make because people will give you the budget they think they can make back, and studios no longer wanted to break even. They wanted to make a measure of 4 because you have to split with the theaters, you have to split, prints and advertising, you have to split with the theaters, so you need to make 4 times the budget. And these studios, when they're beholden to shareholders, breaking even means you failed. You have not delivered profits for the shareholders. And all the time, I mean, all the people that I still know and like work around who are in that and are like, okay, we're going into production next week. It's going to be great. And then you get that last minute thing of not cut this scene, but cut a third. How do you already have a schedule. You already have days. You already have everybody cast. You already have sets built. And people are like, cut a third, make on the fly, rewrite the script on the fly, make those sets you've already built work for the kind of bridge scenes between these two things. And there's so many movies in the Dimension catalog that are those, where last minute budget changes suddenly make, like, people didn't try to shoot a bad script. So many things are just, oh, we have to change this at literally the last second. So then you have a bad movie.
There you go. I wonder if like a lot of times they shoot these scenes that like that'll go the special features on the Blu-ray or on the DVD, or at least now they're like, yeah, that'll be on the Scream Factory Blu-ray at some point or the Arrow Video. I doubt it, but it would be cool if that was the mindset there. Like send like the wasted parts.
Well, there's so many. It's like with the Warner's movies. There's so much visual effects that you can shoot the thing, you can shoot the plate, you can shoot the actors, but like with Batgirl, once they started getting the weird, bad audience reactions, kill the movie and take the tax write-off, because you're still going to have to pay $70 to $100 million to finish the film, because shooting now is a tiny amount of the film. There's the secondary thing of do the visual effects for the entire film. And that's the budget over again. The budget of a film has so little to do with principal photography anymore, that looking at a rough assembly and saying, we could spend $100 million to finish this, but the movie's never going to get there. So let's just trash it and not waste that money, and then never have to do a split, never have to lose money on prints and advertising. And it's a tax write-off for the year. I mean, Batgirl, unfortunately, is probably the future of those kind of films, where balking at a visual effects finish is what kills the movie. So I still can't believe what happened to Batgirl. But
yeah, no, me either. You just think about all the time used and wasted ultimately for that kind of thing. And I think Hulu kind of gets that. They're talking about the new Hellraiser being on Hulu. It's not having a theatrical release. Then you get a couple of months ago, you got Prey, the new Predator movie that released on Hulu too. And I think that these studios are starting to see, well, we can make a movie and not give it the theatrical money, but like put it towards streaming, and you get a very competent mid-grade movie, and you can still add some creative stuff to it. So like maybe if streaming was an option, I bet Hellraiser 4 was probably going to get that sort of treatment.
Like what kind of like going to video?
Yeah, like going to a stream, and it'd probably gain some notoriety in a good way, instead of like how it probably was presented. It was a theatrical release that, I don't know, maybe you could tell me, Mark, when it came out in 96, was it like a Dead on Arrival type of reaction? Or was it more like, it's the Hellraiser 4?
No, everybody knew it was Dead on Arrival. No attention, no marketing, no nothing, dumped into a few theaters. I had to drive to a theater I've never been to. I went to every theater in Houston. I think that's the only time I ever saw a movie at this one mall, was when I saw a Hellraiser Bloodline at it. It was like in the middle of nowhere. I think I saw Romeo is Bleeding at that theater. And that was the only other. It was not given any kind of release. People knew. It was like the remake of Invasion of the Body Snatchers that Ewa Ferrara did. It was supposed to be this big thing. You're like, it's Ewa Ferrara. And then when it came out, it's like on one screen, and you're kind of like, I guess they lost hope at the 11th hour. And they did a contractually obligated theatrical release. So,
yeah. So I wonder if, like, with streaming, it's kind of helping those kind of movies. Maybe it'll be a Shudder exclusive, quote unquote. You know what I mean? Kind of like the Red Badge there.
You need marketing. You need Prey. If everything happened like Prey, where they put a lot of money behind they spent more on marketing than they spent on making it, which is, happens. Once they knew they had something that audiences liked, they didn't have to put in theaters, which is a mess. I mean, putting anything into the theaters during COVID was a crapshoot. Will this be the week of a surge? And you've got all the trailers saying it's coming out on this date. You've got every theater holding spots. And then that's the weekend that it's in the middle of a surge and no one goes to theaters. With streaming, they were like, we have this movie people love. We have a lot of subscribers to Hulu, but we have even more subscribers to the Disney Plus Hulu ESPN bundle. We don't have to lose money on a split with theaters. If we just put this there's a thing called first streams. And if we can show to our stockholders that, we're eating it on the budget of Prey, but the number of first streams, people who bought Hulu, subscribed to Hulu, and this is the first thing they did, proving that they subscribed to Hulu because of Prey. Financially, then that makes sense for them. And it become first streams for AWOCs. It's the new streaming term. Adults without kids and the first streams on the streaming service. And that Prey, like Hocus Pocus 2 this past week, was a huge driver for Hulu subscribers. So for Hulu, Prey, even though it lost all that money you might have made theatrically, even though they ate the cost of the budget, it's huge for them because they made that money off subscriptions. So I hope it remains a model.
Right. I mean, it kind of shows how much has changed since the 90s all the way till then. And then even the 2000s, you can even just get into that. But with Hellraiser 4, we talked, saying about how it became that contemporary time and then it goes to the future, 21, whatever. It's this whole idea of like bloodlines, because like in the future, the guy trying to figure out the box is the toy maker's future generation descendant, and is figuring out this box, and he's still, I'm assuming because it's in 2145 or 2165 or whatever, he's learned enough about his bloodline and about the Cenobites and this whole idea of like where he came from, and trying, because he's obviously trying to do the anti-box equation and destroy Pinhead and close this gate forever. And Pinhead knows exactly who he is, and Angelique, and it becomes almost like a Doom-esque movie at that third and final, which I don't mind. I like Doom, the movie, like that last, like near the end, those the kind of hell nightmare
corridors, like the whole movie is shot in two hallways that they make look like a whole space station, but they're just repurposing the hallways.
Yeah. I kind of like that idea. And then you get to see, the Cenobites from the 2000s time in the future as well. So that's also my question is, like, in Clive Barker's vision, was the Cenobites not this established group of, I guess, like these demons, I guess you could call them, or were they always supposed to be ever changing? Because obviously we don't get the same Cenobites we got from the first two movies. They're completely different in this one as well.
It's weird because the way he talks about them in Hellbound Heart in the first novella is there is no Pinhead. There's the leader. There's the Hell Priest. And he continues that in Scarlet Gospels. And I think in Scarlet Gospels, he says, the one the humans started referring to as Pinhead to get the reader. And then he never says it again. It's hard to say because there was always the female one. There was always kind of the Butterball one. And so he designed them, but they're so different in the movie from how he even has them in the story. So for him, as he built out with Tortured Souls and what they did with Hellraiser 2, you get the idea once you start to understand them as earlier victims or people who have been on this road before, you're like, so there's this entire trail of Cenobites There's a zillion Cenobites out there, and the only one that's kind of different is the Hell Priest, is Pinhead, who has ascended to this kind of leadership position. But all the others are potentially, and that's what's so mysterious about the series. They don't necessarily have to be the same, because then Angelique is born as a Cenobite across Bloodline. She becomes one of the Cenobites. She goes from demon to possessing someone to then being a Cenobite. And again, spoilers on the Bruckner Cenobite, on the Bruckner Hellraiser, you see that again. There's a character, and the whole journey of the film is someone becoming a Cenobite. One of the side characters becomes a Cenobite, and it feels like it's spelling out something that was hinted at in Bloodline with the arc of Angelique. So
that's a good pull. That makes sense. Like it's like over like a different legion, almost the same. And I guess Cenobites have like this sort of like transformation that moves from one segment to the next. That's a really good point. And you don't really see that too much up until Bloodline. It kind of, like we said, 3 feels off. It feels weird compared to the first 2, but 4 nestles in real nicely with the first 2 for sure.
Well, 3 feels like you're making Cenobites as like, oh, people are watching Hellraiser because they're entertained by the Cenobite makeup. They're like, oh, we're going to do all these new Cenobites. And so you have Cenobites almost as marketing tool. You have Cenobites as, what are they going to look like this time? And they lean into that in the third one. And the fourth one, yeah, they have the twins, which is a little bit of that, but then they really get into the mythology of it with Angelique. And that was really interesting. And it just, I don't know. For some reason, there's this weird idea that Candyman, that is like a lost, fractured Cenobite, that it's a victim, but he was killed, so he's a sympathetic victim. He is someone who endured great pain after illicit pleasure, and now he is this. It's hard to make that connection for me mentally between Candyman and Hellraiser, but the thinking is the same, that you become a cursed creature. And in Candyman's, when Robitaille's thing, he's got the hook embedded in his flesh. He has his permanently severed arm. He has bees that fly out of him. There are aspects of Daniel Robitaille that are that when you really try to figure out what a Cenobite is, it's not that far off from what not his origin, but how he expresses his own current pain. So
I see
the
that.
way of looking at the Cenobites through that.
I never thought of it that way, but that does. I mean, yeah, I can't see them being like together in like the shared universe or anything like that, but that totally makes sense. The same mindset is there.
You are tortured by what has led you here, and that you have to carry forever. So, but Robitaille is sympathetic. Pinhead is not. So, but you still love him anyway because he's capricious and arrogant and he's an asshole. So
right. I was gonna say, like, it seems like with the Cenobites, I don't know. In all the other ones, it seems like he has like this posse. It seems like these are my Cenobites, and then it's like in the fourth one, he's like, I'm making my own, but I have to work with Angelique, which I think it's a really good combination of like them playing off each other. Although I would have wished that Pinhead was kind of like the main guy, or the main bad guy in this, and it's just basically him just wrecking havoc. Even though he is really just causing all the carnage and mayhem. You do get that nice dynamic. I don't know. Do you think that kind of works better? Because in the first couple ones, it's just mostly him running the show, and I really enjoyed that.
Yeah, they're like henchmen. And in this, again, if Bloodline had been if they had really kind of brought out that relationship that's in Atkins' script, where Angelique represents the old version of hell and Pinhead's the new order, I think that would have made a really even better dynamic between the two of them as competing ideas of even what a Cenobite's mission is to be on Earth. How is a Cenobite meant to relate to humans? Because Angelique is a servant to Parks and Recreation's Adam Scott. She is still, but then he gets in the way of hell, which kind of works, kind of doesn't.
Yeah.
And she kills him for like no, and you're like, oh, okay, there's that clause. It's like the Santa Claus of the Hellraiser series. She gets in the way of hell and she just offs him, and you're like, okay, fine, whatever.
Yeah.
But that idea of playing the two of them off in that way, I think would have been a really interesting way to, again, as we're talking about what I personally think would make a more interesting Bloodline, really seeing this evolution of Pinhead over several centuries. I think building out Angelique as the person that that the exposition is bounced off of, that she's a constant, Pinhead is not. So you really see that evolution through her eyes. I think could have worked great, but I don't think the Weinsteins ever understood Hellraiser. So
yeah. I mean, you think about like Stephen King and his works with like making the novels for these movies. I don't know how much work and hand that Stephen King had in a lot of those movies, but it sounds like, from what you've told me and what I can only imagine when watching the Hellraiser movies, that Clive Barker was definitely like in the room. He was on the set, kind of saying like, "Yeah, that thing kind of works," or "No, that thing doesn't kind of work." And
at least for the first two, yeah.
It just seems like he was very much like, "This is how I want it to look," because it's every transformation scene in Hellraiser 1 and 2 feels like it was made with love. It felt like somebody cared about it. It's like the first two movies with those transformation scenes, I always think of American Werewolf in London, right, with that werewolf transformation, and you think about The Thing, but it's like Hellraiser 1 and 2 have some of the probably the best like transformation of the body. You think about like Brian Usena's like Society and that crazy shit with body transformations, but like Hellraiser really just takes it for the cake. You know what I mean?
Well, the whole thing's built towards it. It's so many of the bad versions of that movie, you're seeing like a regular old horror film, and then there's like some stunt makeup transformation thing that you're kind of like, oh, they wanted to do this thing that people would remember, but it's not character based. It's not really part of the flow of the film. Hellraiser, you really got that the filmmakers and the people behind the story of it really needed you to understand what pain is going into this. There's work being done. So when you see the imitations of it, it's like the Planet of the Apes sequels. The first Planet of the Apes is such this weird religious metaphor. It's like there's so many things in that movie. And then a lot of the sequels were, so it's a planet of apes, and that's it. And there were certain pieces of it, but you kind of leave that depth behind. I think that's something that the franchise missed once they didn't feel they were in the shadow of Barker, and even his sketches, his drawings for the franchise really do feel like they influenced Cenobites going forward. But once his presence isn't being felt, I don't think it was the freeing aspect that the Weinsteins might have thought. Like, his name's still on him, he got a check. But as long as you don't have Atkins, who worked with him and is showing him scripts and asking his input and getting all of that, once you lose that, we're beholden to what Clive thinks, it becomes a very different franchise. It becomes Twilight Zone, but instead of Rod Serling, you have Pinhead. And that's not what the first four films were. Even at the lowest points, even in 3, that's not what 3 was. So,
yeah.
And I am not here to defend Hellraiser 3: Hell on Earth.
Right. No, I don't blame you. And for some reason, they include that in the Arrow box sets, but they don't make enough room for that fourth one too, which feels like an incomplete box set.
Yeah. What can you do?
Yeah, right. It's like, it seems like when horror movies get to that fourth movie, it's always like the end of a trilogy. They say an end of a trilogy, but it's still really 4 movies because it's like it's weird how horror movies do that.
But sometimes by the fourth one, it's a new company. I mean, look at this new one. Things have changed hands. Things are kind of, I mean, think about how many different iterations of Friday the 13th. There's the big official Paramount years when Frank Mancuso Jr. is in the credits of every film. And then that just stops. And then they become the New Line movies. And then there are the old original Boston Mob money ones with the first ones. And there's different iterations. So you're serving different masters across a franchise. And 4 really does feel like, okay, now we're teeing up an endless straight to video franchise. So And it's tough because they didn't make that decision before the movie started. So
I see. That totally makes more sense the way you say that with those kind of movies, and especially when you talk about Friday the 13th. Yeah, that definitely feels like that. Oh, geez, I had like a really good thought that I totally blanked out on. Man, why am I blanking on that? I don't know. I'll probably forget it right before the end of it. Let's see, Friday the 13th. We talked about that part. It's something you had said. Something about we get to the fourth. Oh, my big gripe. Why is the new one called Hellraiser? Why are we doing this with new reboot, quote-unquote, movies? We got Scream this year, and it's just called Scream. We got a Texas Chainsaw Massacre movie. It's called Texas Chainsaw Massacre. Why
it doesn't test well. It doesn't test. Again, I hate to like the inside baseball of it. Sequels don't test well. Like putting that 4, 5, 6 because you have this whole idea of the first movies are great, but once you start getting up there, like the Halloween franchise after 4, you start getting diminishing returns. When people think of a 6th or 7th movie in a franchise, it just calls to mind the Dimension movies. It just calls to mind Children of the Corn 7. You just start thinking of the diminishing returns. You don't think about Live and Let Die. You don't think, because they didn't put numbers on the James Bond franchise, you start to think, oh, they have to be running out. They have to be running out of gas. And it's such a great, I mean, Friday the 13th proved it. You slap Friday the 13th on Friday the 13th part 12 and sold a lot of tickets. They did that and it makes sense. And my residual checks say Friday the 13th part 12, but the poster says Friday the 13th. So it works, and it worked for Hellraiser. If you called the Hulu Hellraiser like 11 or 10 or 9 or whichever they're going to choose to say, it really is much more of a sequel to 2. If you call it that, people, should I watch the other movies first? Or, I can't just jump into this series. But if you con the casual viewer into, oh no, it's a reboot, it's a reboot, it's this, they don't have to care. And the Hulu Hellraiser is essentially a sequel. The Lamar Sons box exists. People have known about it. People have been playing with this for a long time. They know the Lament configuration. It is a sequel. But calling it Hellraiser suddenly becomes an event that Hulu can sell in a way that they can't sell Hellraiser 9. I mean, Predator, calling it Prey, I mean, that was genius marketing. That was
exactly.
There's so many great reasons why calling it Prey, because she's the prey, and like you got just genius. Whoever was like, you know what, we're calling it Prey. Yeah, deserves stock options. What a genius that guy is, or
whoever that was. I mean, think about if Hellraiser is at Hellraiser 1, and then you get Hellbound, Hellraiser 2. Imagine if they kept going with that, like Hellbound, and then, like Hellseeker, and then just calling it Inferno,
Hell in a handbasket. Yeah, you could just keep doing hell jokes. Highway to Hell. Do one on the road where Pinhead's in a car. I mean, yeah, you could really milk that. But I bet they're going to call the next one just Hellraiser. What do you think? Hellraiser 2? Or are they going to call, because they're calling Scream, they're going to call it Scream 6, right? The next one, the New York one?
I think they're going to, I don't know, they're probably going to do the whole damn David Gordon Green thing where they call it Halloween kills, Halloween ends. It's like, it's not ending. It's I think David Gordon Green has dirt on somebody in Hollywood, because why else are we giving him a trilogy of Michael Myers? I don't get it.
I'm fatigued. I am fatigued on those Halloween movies
already.
I'll see them, but I
know.
I don't know.
It's like with Hellraiser. It's like they're probably going to do something like that. They got Hellraiser. They're probably going to be. It's going to probably be called Hellraiser Returns, and then we'll get
Hellraiser. Yeah.
I don't know. This is like the constant internal battle I have with like loving horror movies, and we need to be on Shudder right now, and we need to do like a mini series on like the naming of sequels, because it's like I like seeing a number. I I always think one day in my life I want to go to a theater, and the matinee printouts on the outside the theater is gonna say like Friday the 13th 9. I'm gonna see the I and X or something like that, and it's just gonna be so cool to see like, wow, we're in the 9th movie here. That's awesome. I like
it's a
numerics
spiral.
like that.
A Saw story. I mean, nothing against Spiral, but the marketing of that was very like, so how do we can't call it Saw because we already went to that well of starting it over again, so we're going to call it this. It's a sequel, but it was weird how that would have been a fun marketing meeting. Like sitting to watch, how do you do this again? How do you figure out how to reboot something that's already, and Chainsaw, they're doing that every time that changes hands now to Netflix and New Line, wherever that lands next. They're having that problem where they just kind of call every single one Texas Chainsaw Massacre now. And so there's like 10 movies. It's like The Haunting. It's one of those movies that every 10 years there's another movie called The Haunting. Every 10 years or every 5 years there's a movie called The Texas Chainsaw Massacre.
Pretty much. I think every studio needs to adopt the Ty West way, where you have X and then you call the next one Pearl, and then the next one I forget what he called the next one's gonna be, but that's the way to do it. Or even Rob Zombie, for crying out loud, House of Thousand Corpses, Devil's Rejects, 3 from Hell. That's how you name sequel movies like that.
That was smart.
Yeah,
but that's also he had control. He could call him whatever the hell he wanted to. When you're on Hulu straight, like it's not up to the like that's the marketing me. I'm sure Bruckner had a piece of what he was that. I'm sure he had a voice in the meeting, but so much of what that was going to be has to be decided of what's going to sell this movie. So you couldn't have called it House of or Hellraiser of 1,000 Corpses or whatever crazy title. Though it does feel like at this point they probably did go in with a pitch and said it's called Hellraiser, and they were like, get our checkbook. And because if you just say we're going to be the definitive reboot quel or whatever you want to call it of the Hellraiser franchise, we have the rights because Toberoff freedom and we have the rights to these different things, then you can just say, okay, that's enough, and we can call it Hellraiser. We don't have to call it Jason Lives or we don't have to call it Jason Goes to Hell. We're not going to futz with the franchise title. Okay, Hellraiser, that makes sense. Here's $8 million or whatever.
Would have been cool if they called it Pinhead, or if Scream 2022 was called Ghostface. Just name it after the.
I wonder if
character.
people have. I wonder if they've made that. I wonder if people have had that idea. If there was some meeting where somebody was like, "We're going to call the next Scream Ghostface," and they were just like, "No, we're just going to keep calling it Scream." So
Yeah,
I don't know. But
God,
I love the
the
Scream. That's the
movies.
thing. Did you saw the new Scream, right?
Yeah.
Okay, on paper, that's one of my favorite twists ever. They're like, yeah, people aren't into stab anymore, so we have to reboot the real murders. I'm like, that again with Malignant. I'm like, that is amazing. That idea is so out there. That's like Wes Craven's New Nightmare. It's so weird that I'm totally into that as a reveal of that's what this is. So
I think the best thing about it was like it was kind of giving the middle finger to the fans who hate The Last Jedi and the whole legacy sequel characters and actors and movies. I like that aspect of it. Jack Quaid, I mean, it was interesting to see the whole Jack Quaid thing because it was like, oh, he's so obviously the killer, he can't be the killer, and they're like, just kid, you guys don't get dumb on me, he's gonna be a killer. So I like that. I just think, can't we leave Nev Campbell alone? It's like, I got nervous with Texas Chainsaw Massacre 2022. I got nervous with that too when they brought back the original actress and character, and I'm like, she's like doing the whole Laurie Strode thing, and it's like, let these people live their lives in this universe, Yeah,
that was when I saw that trailer. I was like, I mean, I get it. Halloween, the first day, it made like $100 million.
Oh yeah,
I understand that decision. As a fan, I don't have to watch the movie, but I understand if you're a financial person why that's a decision you make. And I guess that's it. I don't have to watch the film, so.
And not every Scream Queen.
Engage.
Yeah, not every Scream Queen is like Jamie Lee Curtis, who's going to be super nice and supportive of the project. That so I can see why she's still behind it and championing it all the time. But yeah, Halloween Kills. Oh man, yeah, not a sequel we'll probably ever cover on here. again, I'm just always gonna be mad that we're getting a David Gordon Green trilogy, but we couldn't even get Rob Zombie to do a tackle on even Halloween 3, Season of the Witch, or just let him finish out a trilogy. I know he ended it perfectly with 2, but I know it's probably because they said you're not doing a third movie in any way.
Well, the movie didn't. Again, Halloween 2 didn't make that much money.
Nope.
It was sad because he had all those projects all over town, all those weird horror things like his Blob remake, like all those really strange films. And then Halloween 2 didn't quite work, and it all kind of went away, and he went back into indie filmmaking, and he didn't get big budgets ever again. So, and then he made one of his best films, Lords of Salem, which is such a strange movie. So,
yep. Basically,
know.
I don't think A24 exists unless Lords of Salem came out, because Lords of Salem is an A24 movie, and he did it before them and stuff, in my opinion. So, but yeah, Mark, is there anything else you wanted to talk about with the Hellraiser franchise before we start wrapping up?
Everybody should read Clive Barker. Like, it's funny because the movies are great. The stuff he worked on, the movies he worked on, I still love, and I still love Bloodline because of seeing. Obviously, I'm a huge Clive Barker fan, so seeing the texture, seeing the Barker that's woven in behind it. It's like, again, what I said. I went to Universal Halloween Horror Nights to see his maze, and was like, oh, the weird underground Tremors-y worm stuff is stuff he had in his American Horror script that he was going to come back and direct. He has obsessions, and I love the obsessions as they are there, buried in Hellraiser Bloodline. And it sucks. It's like later, once the writers left The Simpsons and there were people copying the original writers of The Simpsons, the original Hellraiser, when you feel the Barker in it, they're fantastic. When that's gone, it's not as interesting to me, no matter who is making the film. It's just that part's missing. So the only thing I would hope anybody listening to this is, like, just seek out. He's such a phenomenal writer, and those 4 first books of Blood are like life-changing. It's like reading Edgar Allan Poe for the first time. It's life-changing stuff. So everybody read Clive Barker this Halloween.
There you go. I mean, I might have to put my Ray Bradbury books down and start checking out some of Clive Barker's stuff. Again, he's always been like this name that's synonymous with like hell and like dimension, and almost too scary for me to dive into. And now that I'm older and going into it more, I'm like, wow, this stuff is pretty sweet. This is pretty good stuff. And I think the internet, maybe because of recency with the whole new Hellraiser, and people are going to rewatch those first 2 Hellraiser movies. But like, yeah, those are truly some of the best like horror movies of the 80s, in my opinion. Like, they're just so good. Again, I think Hellraiser 2 came out in 88, and 88 was a great year for horror too. We talked about Rob Zombie's The Blob. I mean, you get the Blob remake in 88. I mean,
a very watchable remake. So.
Yeah, Kevin Dillon, gotta love him.
Yeah.
When he's not a creepy, alt-right guy from Platoon. But
it's funny because Barker's stuff then, it's weird because once he kind of matured a little as a writer, I was just made me think of that. Sacrament is one of those books. It's just it's a weird elegy book. It's not horror, but he got some of that stuff out of his system with Books of Blood. His extreme horror, he kind of left behind in the 80s to a certain degree. And the stuff that comes out in the 90s and the early aughts is sad. And then he switched it all. He pretended he didn't write any of that and started writing these YA books that he sold to Disney. It's very weird, the Aberrat books. But he really became a different writer after Hellraiser, after those films, and after Lord of Illusions. And it just felt like maybe he did that. Maybe he got that out of his system. His obsession with magic that's in Lord of Illusions and Hellraiser, or in Bloodline. All that stuff kind of went, and it becomes much more about America. He became a very American writer. And it was funny because you mentioned Bradbury. I mean, there's nobody more California sorcery than Ray Bradbury. And Barker with Sacrament, it's so just, you get that kind of weird, and Cold Heart Canyon, you get that weird California version of him And then he starts moving in a Bradbury direction because so many fantasy writers in Southern California do. And it's weird to read those with the idea that he is here halfway through his career as Ray Bradbury's, living only a few blocks away from him. So,
Okay.
and they were always at the same signings and always at the same stuff. So, I wonder
Ray
if there was
Bradbury's-
any of that there.
Ray Bradbury is a local hero for us, like growing up in the Northern Illinois area. Like, I mean, he lived right near there, so he's a local legend. So, but
we
hey,
now claim him wholeheartedly here in Southern California. So you'll have to fight everybody in like the San Fernando Valley who's like, oh, but he lives right there. He had that house, and he would always come down and go to that Mission Hills thing. Like, it's
that's
so
cool.
we claim Ray Bradbury now.
Oh man! Well, I'm going through the Illustrated Man, and I'm waiting for some sort of like film adaptation of that in some way.
Oh, there was. Rod Steiger made an illustrated. They made it. It's really bad.
Oh,
yeah. They made a movie. They made a movie of Illustrated Man, and it's just. There's a reason it's been left behind a little bit.
There you go. Well, hey, Mark, I want to thank you so much for giving the podcast another chance to come talk about another movie and give us some of that insight that, again, I just cannot provide. And I'm always just talking with my friends online and thinking about why did they do this or why don't they do that? And now I get some of those answers there. And thank you also for letting me go through memory lane with like the early 2000s and all that, like post 9/11, angst and stuff in films, because those are just a part of my childhood, and they're just like, they seep into my taste now. And it's good
to create an aesthetic from Z grade Titanoboa nonsense. That's where you want. Like, it's obviously how Picasso worked. So Titanoboa. He's like, I will create this next. Thank you for having me on your show. I will see you next year. We have to do this again next Halloween and figure out some other movie. Hopefully not Final Destination 6.
Yeah. We'll have to make you come on so we can talk about another franchise with deep cut knowledge on. But yeah, Mark, again, I want to thank you so much for coming back on and talking about this stuff. And actually, you were the one who pushed me into going further into the Hellraiser franchise. It's like I'm tackling a couple things because I've been going through the Psycho franchise on another podcast, but now my thing was like, do I go through the Wrong Turn franchise? Or the other one was like, do I get those Dimension Extreme movies and watch the Hellraiser movies? And now I'm kind of doing a mix of both. I got through the first 4, so now I'm going to go through the Wrong Turn 4. So I want to thank you for that push right there.
Wrong Turn. So it's funny because the Psycho franchise, I don't know. There's so much good in Psycho 2 and Psycho 3 that it's and Psycho 4 to some degree, but it is one of those franchises that rewards another sally forth through that crazy franchise. So
there you go.
And then Bates Motel, which is fantastic. So
yeah. Well, I mean, Mark, if you ever want to tune into that, and listeners, if you want to hear my annoying voice talk about the Psycho franchise with my buddy Daniel on the Cobwebs podcast, you'll be able to tune in there and check that out. So we're just wrapping up Psycho 4 with Matt Bledsoe on the Film Feast podcast. But there you go.
All right.
But yeah,
thank you so much for having me on.
No problem, Mark. But I do want the listeners to know, where can we find you? Where can we like plug you? And I'm sure other people are gonna be wanting to ask you some more stuff. Once the episode's posted. So where can we find you?
Like nowhere. I've deleted all my social media. I guess like I'm somewhere on Goodreads. Yeah, that's it. I have an author page on Goodreads, and I occasionally update. Like I have one of those author pages on Facebook when I have new short stories getting published. I always put a link to them. But other than that, I take my kids to school. I mean, I'm not out there. So
you're just too busy hanging out with Sam Raimi all the time.
I'm too busy going to like my daughter's show choir rehearsal and like taking the other one to fencing and karate. So there's no illusions here. There's no like the Hollywood of it all. It's like no. I'm a soccer mom. So
there you go.
Get the kids in. So
well, Mark, again though, I want to thank you for coming back on. It was a lot of fun. I hope to have you on. Hopefully not in a year's again passing, but again, big big fan. So other than that, for those listening, don't forget to tune in next week. We're going to have Roman Chamani and Tyler Jensen on to talk about Final Destination 3 on next Friday as well. So
A great film.
Really great. I'm so excited to have those two on. But other than that, if you are a fan of the podcast, don't forget to follow us on Twitter at SequelPod. Email the show at sequelpod@gmail.com if you have recommendations or thoughts and stuff as well. We always like to hear that feedback there. You can follow me, Chris, at Hertastic_Chris. Don't forget to follow the YouTube channel as well. But other than that, if you are not going through the Hellraiser franchise in October, you really care about cinema.
What are you even doing with your life? Yeah.
There you go. Other than that, you have
It has
a great...
such sights to show you.
There you go. Other than that, we'll see you next time.